There's another model that I've been working on, which might be more what you're looking for, which is this idea. When I first took on this position of leadership development consultant, I was an engineer in as I said earlier, in my first career. So I have this brain that sort of has big blueprint, little details, big blueprint, little details as I think about things. So I needed a framework for myself to understand how to do leadership development, for how to offer leadership development. What do we offer? Who are we offering it for? What do we want the learning goals to be when we do leadership? So I worked with that for about a year, and then I worked with some groups of lay leaders from some of the districts in our region. So they're lay leaders, church presidents, things like that. Some people were also leadership development professionals in the corporate world. So I reflected with them about what do leaders need? What do congregational leaders need? If you pay to send some of your people off to leadership school, what do you want them to come back knowing? And of course, it's not just about skills, right? There's embodiment of what it means to be a leader. It's the non-anxious presence that we want leaders to have. There's a lot of things. There's also, the world is changing, right? That's been one of the themes of this General Assembly. How do we respond to a changing context? So, of course, being a little bit of that engineer brain again, I came up with 12 things, three groups of 4 items. And I'm just going to share these a little bit. I'll go through and describe them a little bit. These are all, on the UUA website. We've gone into the UUA website and actually reorganized the leadership development section using these 12, you can see them here, the 12 different. I use the term competency just because people know what that means. But competency also implies that you'll achieve it someday. And of course, that's not really the case when it comes to these items. So, but I think of them as areas, I call them the 12-part foundation of faithful leadership formation. That's the committee title, but the working title is competencies. So if you go to the UUA website, you'll see what all these are, a description of them. I'll share a little bit about some of them so you can get the idea. That's something you can look up for yourself. If you have a smartphone, that will take you to the website. Your QR code. I'll go back there in a second if folks are ready. Let's see. Okay. So part of the reason, again, this is the 12 things that I think about, items that I think about. The first one is multicultural sensibility. So we know that the demographics of the United States are changing. We know that most of our congregations are not very multicultural. We have, the same class, we're very homogenous. But the world is changing, so we have to understand what we need to do and with our own sensibility and the sensibility of our congregations to help address that. When you go to the web page, I just printed out the descriptions. Here's an example of what it would say. So it's understanding how race and privilege operate in our lives and institutions, actively working to dismantle racism, and understanding how culture affects beliefs, values, and mental models, and having strategies to bridge them. So, for example, somebody asked me earlier today why I use the term reverend when I talk about my colleagues, like Reverend Mary, Reverend Fred, and I had to think about it for a second, because I've developed this habit, and I started doing that intentionally, because I know that when I work with African American churches, that they always use the honorifics when talking about people. So when we call our minister by our first name, it's odd to someone who comes out of an African American tradition. So I started using the honorifics when talking about the ministers, and it's now a habit of mine. I didn't even realize I do it anymore. So there's an example of where I worked on my own multicultural sensibility. The other thing I have on there is different practices about how you can live into that practice in your own life. And also I have a core value on each page. So for example, for Multicultural Sensibility, the core value is we are committed to the practice of radical hospitality where we encounter each person as a gift. We are committed to the ideal of true diversity because we understand that each person has something to contribute. This enables us to encounter, experience, and integrate diverse ideas and values to work our way closer to our understanding of the truth. And if any of you were in my theological understanding of covenant, that's very similar to the process theology stuff I talked in that workshop. And then it also has a whole bunch of resources. So there's links to video, and these aren't just UUA resources. If I find something that the Methodists did, like a nice video, I'll link to that, and you'll just have to translate. There's links to articles, blog posts. We have some recorded webinars that are available. So every time I find a resource in that area, I put it on the UUA website, or so do my colleagues. So the second, is this helpful? I want to track with this, okay? So the next competency is generational sensibility. Kimberly Divas is doing a workshop, I think later today, on the idea that how different baby boomers are from the millennial generation. I mean, the brains are just wired differently. So how do we, as leaders, develop understandings of that? How do you know when you're doing a capital campaign, how do you approach the baby boomer versus how do you approach the millennial? There's just a different, you have to have that kind of sensibility about different generations approach the world differently. And being 20 today is way different than being 20 when I was 20, so understanding that as well. Contextual sensibility. Twitter, how many people tried Twitter for the first time this GA? Some of you? Yeah, it's kind of weird. I'm actually getting into it more. But not just Twitter, but just other things in the world, how our brains are being wired differently from our interactions with the world. I'm thinking also, there's on the UA website, I have a link to an article called "The Church as Wikipedia." And I think this is a chapter out of a book called Open Source Church. This chapter in this book probably completely changed the way I think about church. Because if you think about it today, someone in their 20s grew up with the idea, not the encyclopedia that has the truth in it, but this interactive source that everybody goes to, most people go to these days for information that anybody can edit. And so they walk into our congregations and they have this board of trustees that locks themselves away in a room and you have no way of getting any idea even heard, let alone acted upon. There's a different context there. There's an expectation of participation that's much different because of this Wikipedia experience. So I highly commend that article to you. System sensibility. How many of you have taken a Healthy Congregations or Smart Church program? And some of you have Leadership School, SULI, DBLE, Midwest Leadership School. The systems understanding is how everything is interrelated, how affect can make a big difference. If there's anxiety in the room, it's contagious. How to keep the anxiety low, those types of things. So those are all sensibilities. They're not really skills, it's just different lenses to view the world. So the next 4 things are things to do with the self. So the first one is embodying UU DNA. So for those of us who walked, like both Deb and I did, we walked into our congregations and said, these are our people. But really, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist? I had some really strange notions when because of my first few experiences. I thought it was a really good thing to go up and make a political statement during Joys and Concerns that took 3 minutes. That was one of the, because it was happening. Okay, that's not really what we're about. But, so I had to sort of figure out what was the permanent, what was the transient in Unitarian Universalism. So giving opportunities for people, not only for the new UU class, but also about when and how to go deeper. So I know that the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York has a Wellsprings program, which is kind of like covenant groups on steroids. The people who go through regular covenant groups get to do Wellsprings, and they've got another program that goes even deeper than that. So these opportunities to really understand what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist leader and not just a leader. Mission focused. This could have gone in any category, but I had to make it even. So this idea of what's my purpose and what is our church's, our congregation's purpose, and really being focused on that. The vision, today's leadership books are all about living into vision, communicating vision, having the leadership be cohesive around vision. So it's this idea of, and if you've ever had a district staff person in your congregation, you would have heard this word at least a dozen times, I'm sure. Spiritually grounded. How do I achieve my center? When things are really going crazy, I need to be able to find that quiet place within myself so I can be centered and then be fully present to what's going on. Presence, when we're working with one another, that attention, and that connection to where really my core is, however theologically you want to describe that. And then just basic emotional intelligence, knowing what's your baggage and what's not your baggage, knowing what triggers you, learning how to pause when you need to pause before the thing you don't want to say comes out of your mouth accidentally. Forbearance is what they called it back in the old days. This one's my favorite, skills to grow other leaders. It's really great to be up there on the, leading the congregation, but, looking down the ladder and pulling other people up is just as important. My favorite book, again, this is on the website under the resources, is a book called Multipliers. Has anybody read that by Liz Wiseman? Man, I just want to walk around with a cart full of those books and hand them out to leaders. Because she talks about how there are leaders, managers, who have the ability to bring out people's capacity. And then there's other people that the same people can work for, and they just wither up. And what's the difference between the two different kinds of leadership? She calls the second kind of leader diminishers. And what's the difference between a diminisher and a multiplier? And most diminishers don't realize they're diminishing. So one of the things she talks about is sometimes as leaders, we're so eager to get our opinion out there, we don't make space for other people to have their opinions. So she has a lot of great case studies out of the corporate world, but for me, that's been one of the best books that I've read on helping to grow other leaders and really appreciating people for their skills, seeing them for who they are, and then inviting them to use the skills and gifts that you see into a leadership role. Multipliers, Liz Wiseman. There's a free webinar. It's a little tricky to get to, but I put a link to it on the page, so if you want to get a sense of it, you can probably get it at the library too. Change and conflict skills. We all know, I do a lot of change theory, how to be in conflict, healthy conflict, the 5 types of conflict. There's a lot of stuff out there. We're putting a lot of webinars out there on this, so just really important stuff as a leader. Communication skills, how to listen deeply, but also how to get your message out. Peter Morales, the president, was talking about this branding thing. But part of it is, how do we articulate who we are in a way that people can understand? How do we articulate our mission so it's invitational to people who join our congregation? How do we have our website set up so it tells who we are to the seekers, but also has information for our members to use? All those kinds of skills and sensibilities. And finally, management skills, which, when we think of leadership development, sometimes we just stop there, so that's why I left it last. But it's still important. You want to know how to run a meeting, you want to know how to take good minutes, you want to know parliamentary procedure when you have a really difficult topic and you want to be able to control discussion. Those are all still important skills. And so my thinking on this is everything sort of helps to feed into this. in the Church of Renee, the perfect church that I get to design and start all the systems, I would invite everyone to have their own individual learning serving plan. What do I want to do? What would I want to do in the congregation that would match my skills and passions to what the congregation's mission is? And then what do I need to do to learn, or what do I need to learn in order to do that well? The second is just a congregational leadership development plan. As if you're doing leadership development, nominating committee work, how do you, in your congregation, identify and invite new leaders and get them trained? Right now, at least in the Central East Regional Group, we're using this model to design our programming to make sure we have a good mix of all the different areas, not just, it's really easy to do change and conflict workshops, but there's a lot of the other stuff that's important too, so to make sure that we offer things in all these areas. And then the web and social networking resources, and we're doing, again, the UUA website is set up now with those resources, and also my region has an on-demand website where, as I'm videotaping this, we videotape live workshops and we record live webinars, and then we put them up on this on-demand website so that you can get the materials and stuff with them. It's password protected, it's free, but we can share materials under the educational fair use laws if it's a site where you have to register to use it. So we've chosen to go in that direction. But there's some really great stuff on there.